Every day, we see millions and billions of dollars spent on this and that.
The Biden administration today pledged a $3 billion investment.
$2.8 billion. $42 billion.
Then we hear about companies getting some crazy valuations.
Apple, the first company ever to hit a $3 trillion market cap.
And countries reaching record debts.
America's debt has now surpassed $31 trillion.
But all of this got me thinking, where in the world did we get all of this money from? They can't just make it up, right? Well, actually, they sort of can. Today, you will learn about the dark truth of money creation and how banks take advantage of it. But you can also benefit from this as well. After watching this video, you'll understand how. Okay, so how is money created in the first place then? It seems like it's a very simple question, yet no one actually teaches us that. And if someone even tries to explain how the system works, it gets way too complicated to understand. But it shouldn't be like that. And that's why you're here, to learn about the subject in simple terms. So we all heard something about the Fed and the Treasury being related to creating more dollars. The process is also known as increasing the money supply. And they do play a big role in this. Still, the government isn't the biggest currency supplier. In fact, over 90% of dollars are created by banks. It might sound surprising, but we'll get to that in a moment. First, let's see how the government adds more money to the American economy. Here is the Treasury. Its main responsibilities are collecting taxes, paying all of the U.S. bills, including interest payments to bond investors, managing public debt, supervising national banks, advising on domestic and international finances, and issuing new dollar bills and coins. But here is the important thing. The Treasury doesn't decide how much money we need to add to circulation. This is the responsibility of the Fed. The Federal Reserve has many different functions, but the main one is conducting monetary policy. You might have heard about this concept. What stands behind it is as simple as regulating inflation and interest rates to guarantee price stability and maximum employment.
Maximum employment and price stability, the monetary policy goals that Congress has assigned us.
So how exactly do these two institutions create new money? When we say the government is printing money, it doesn't mean the Treasury simply prints dollar bills and throws them onto the street. What happens in reality is that the Treasury issues bonds, also known as IOU. Selling these bonds is how the country can take on more debt. In this episode, we talked about how the budget deficit works and what the U.S. national debt really is. To learn the details, feel free to check it out after finishing this video. And now, back to the money printing. So the Treasury issues the bonds and holds an auction where banks can buy part of our national debt, therefore lending money to the country. Banks like to hold those Treasury bonds because they're viewed as risk-free. It is unlikely that the U.S. government will default on its debt, at least not anytime soon. Treasuries also have another advantage. They're relatively easy to sell to someone else in the secondary market to get cash fast. Economists call this ease of converting an asset into money liquidity. And when banks hold these Treasury bonds, the Federal Reserve can buy them. The process of the Fed buying and selling securities is called open market operations, or OMOs. It is important because it is another way to create more dollars. How so? Well, when the Federal Reserve buy bonds, they have an advantage you and I don't have. When we write a check, we need sufficient funds to cover it. But the Fed has no bank deposit that covers this check. What they do instead is create new money. When the Federal Reserve gets government bonds, they pay the banks, but it's very unlikely that banks will sit on that cash because it doesn't generate any income. So from an investment point of view, too much cash is useless. Generally speaking, banks have two options for making their money work: give loans to individuals or businesses and receive interest. Alternatively, they can get more bonds and either receive the interest or resell them again to the Fed. But is the Federal Reserve actually using this instrument to create new money a lot? Well, let's check it out. This is the total face value of U.S. Treasury securities held by the Fed. Since the beginning of 2020, the Federal Reserve has increased its Treasury securities from $2.3 trillion to over $5.7 trillion at its peak. And now we see a slight decline because the Fed is trying to fight inflation by slowing down the economy and decreasing the money supply. So when the Fed buys the bonds issued by the Treasury, it creates more money in the economy. In contrast, when it sells these same securities, it absorbs the money from the system. So that's how the Fed and Treasury have an everlasting process of taking on more debt by creating new money. They might print it in a physical form or create it electronically. The form of currency doesn't really matter. But those who beat the government in creating money digitally are banks. To understand how they do it, let's first get a basic understanding of how the banking system works. Let's say John deposits $1,000 in his bank. He leaves his money there, thinking that the bank will just leave it in his account untouched and pay some interest and give it back to him whenever he needs it. But in reality, the banks don't really hold all the money their depositors bring in. By law, they are required to store only up to 10% of their funds. This number may vary, and often banking institutions have a 0% reserve requirement, which means that a bank can go and reinvest all of the money John brought to them. This system is called fractional reserve banking because banks only keep a fraction of your deposit as reserve. So what do they do with the rest of the money then? Banks can choose to invest that money in government securities, real estate, and other assets. Alternatively, they can lend this money out to someone else. And here is where things get interesting. So in our earlier example, the bank received $1,000 from John. Let's say the bank must store 10% of that money. This leaves John's bank with $900 to be reinvested. And here comes Sarah to get a loan. So the bank lends out these $900 of John's money. But now there is one important thing. When the bank gives John some money to Sarah, he doesn't even know about that transaction, and his balance doesn't go down. So he can still withdraw his $1,000. If John does it, he will have his $1,000 back, but Sarah will obviously keep her borrowed $900 as well. So as a result, there is $1,900 in the economy, and they appear pretty much out of nowhere. That's how banks create money. But this isn't everything. Imagine if Sarah goes and buys some equipment from Bill for $900, and then Bill goes and deposits his money in his bank. Bill's bank will also be able to take at least 90% of that money and lend it to someone else, creating more and more dollars that exist only digitally in the bank's computer. And the thing is that in these examples, we're talking about hundreds of dollars. But in reality, banks are dealing with hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars. If you think about this, it's hard not to wonder, how come the government doesn't regulate the bank's money creation game? Well, this process is actually regulated, and this is how it's done. The Fed pays bank interest on their reserves. That's how sitting in cash ends up being profitable and therefore attractive for the banks. It is like if the Fed will pay you interest on the cash you store at home. Sounds weird, but it makes sense for the banking sector. And the Fed wasn't doing this all the time. In fact, it started to pay interest to the banks only after our financial system collapsed.
What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
In 2008, Congress passed the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act. It appeared in response to the mortgage crisis and included several measures to stabilize the economy. One of them was the Fed paying banks interest for the money they kept in reserves. But why would the Federal Reserve pay interest to banks? This is a measure to regulate American monetary policy. Let's see how it works with an example. So imagine there is a bank that has some money in reserve. Its management understands that sitting in cash will do no good for them. So they're deciding between investing in assets or loaning this money to people or companies. But then comes the Fed and says, no need to do anything with your cash. We'll pay you the same interest you will get from your loan. The Federal Reserve is basically paying banks to not make loans. In this way, the Fed can also have more control over the amount of money in the economy. If they want banks to give out fewer loans, they increase the interest rates to incentivize banks to keep their money in reserves. But if the Federal Reserve wants banks to create money by lending more to boost the economy, all it has to do is lower the interest rates. And that's exactly what we saw after the 2008 crisis and during COVID. When the rates were near zero, more and more people and companies wanted to borrow because it was almost like getting free money. Yet, we're already seeing that the more people are borrowing from the banks, the more dollars are created digitally through the banking system. By the way, when we talk about electronically or digitally created dollars, we don't refer to digital money. The money we see in our accounts or banking apps most likely only exists digitally. And what's amazing about this is that you can go and cash that money out of the bank or an ATM. Yet, we have to keep in mind that if every single person in the US goes to the bank to cash their funds out, we won't have enough money to cover that demand. Still, the dollar we have now isn't digital because a digital currency is a currency that is only available in an electronic form with no cash option whatsoever. So, digital money shares more common things with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, for example. For now, only a few countries have launched or piloted their digital currencies. As for the US, there is a long research going on because the Fed isn't sure if a digital dollar will benefit consumers.
You think it's likely?
I think it's possible, is all I would say.
Okay, so we've seen that dollars are being created easily and quickly, but why is this concerning? There's one rule in the economy. The higher the money supply, the higher the prices. Because the more money we have in the economy, the lower the dollar purchasing power is. I've explained how this works and how to protect yourself from losing money in this video. So check it out if you haven't already, but only after you hear this. There is a way you can benefit even when many new dollars are created. How? Well, first of all, save your money until you have your emergency fund. When you have savings to cover at least 3 months of your usual expenses, stop saving and start investing. Make money work for you. What can you invest in? In all the assets that increases in value over time. So for example, a car is not an investment, or at least not a good one. There might be some exceptions, like if you're using a car to generate income, like the example in this video, but generally speaking, a car isn't a good investment. Instead, you can consider investing in real estate. Obviously, housing prices increase over time. The average house sold in 1990 cost $150,000, whereas now it could cost you well over $500,000, depending on where you're investing. You might think that buying a home before was easier and more affordable, but remember that back in the days, buyers also earned less income and they didn't have the financing tools we have today. But of course, real estate isn't the only investment. You can also consider gold or silver, for instance. If you bought an ounce of gold back in 2001, which isn't that long ago, it will have cost you slightly over $400. Now, the same ounce costs almost $2,000. This is a growth of over 300%. And of course, it is also great to leverage compound interest when something pays you dividends. Let's say you invested in an index fund like the S&P 500, and you reinvested all of the dividends you got. Then, for example, if you invested $1,000 in 1993, you will have now over $17,000. If you invested the same $1,000 in 1973, you will now have over $144,000. And if a person invested in the S&P 500 in 1953 and reinvested all of the dividends, their $1,000 will now turn into more than $1.3 million. This is the wonder of compound interest. The earlier you start, the more you will earn in the end. I know that investing can sometimes be a little too much, but with the proper financial education and the right strategy, you can see big payoffs in the long run, especially if you take action now. If you want to know the best way of investing and understand how our economy works, but explained in a simple way, follow our channel and share this knowledge with your loved ones. See you in the next video. Bye-bye.